everyone, I'm out here with Landon, and if you saw some of my current posts, you realize that Landon and I were feeling under the weather recently and we didn't eat as many vegetables. And so I'm out here looking at these beautiful flowers that have fallen off my fuchsias, and I went, you know, can I use these instead of veggie scraps in my worm bins? I've added them before, of course, but how do these relate in terms of the carbon to nitrogen ratio and some of the other qualities when I'm using these as food for my worms instead of veggie scraps? So you know me, I'm going to dig into the science and I'm going to feed these to my worms, and I'm going to tell you what I found. So let's get into it. All right, so here are the flowers I collected, just some geraniums, a canna lily, and I looked into the research because flower waste is actually a big deal when it comes to how we manage this as a society. As our gardeners, I'm looking to this to feed my worms, but I could also put it in a compost pile. So some of the things I looked at the differences between composting flower waste versus vermicomposting. I'll tell you some of that today, as well as some of the pros and cons of putting flowers into your worm bins. Now, this is peekaboo, and like I said, Landon and I haven't been feeling well, and I'm afraid peekaboo's got a little dry again. The pill bugs are still active, so we'll get into that. I think it's the feeding zone. I'll do a stir, see how the worms are doing while I talk to you about flower waste in a worm bin. This piece of paper is so dry, there aren't any worms on it. I'll just put it next door. All right, so flower waste, as it turns out, is, oh, look at the pill bugs going nuts there. Flower waste has almost an ideal carbon to nitrogen ratio for a worm bin. So it's in that 25 to 37 to 1 ratio. Now, if you don't understand carbon to nitrogen ratios, please look at my deep dive into the research on it. I will put a link to it in the description and a pinned comment. There's a worm on a Starbucks wrapper. Yeah, there's moisture down below. That's great. So the carbon to nitrogen ratio of flower waste, and I'm talking about fresh flower waste, is actually really good for worms. And now, when you look at the carbon to nitrogen ratio, you'll see that that means that flower waste does not need as many of this stuff, as many browns, to compensate it. It's not as high nitrogen as food waste. So when you put flowers into your worm bins, they are almost a total food, much like manure is and some other things with really good carbon to nitrogen ratios. Now, I am still going to add some carbon today because I always like bulking up my bins. But, you know, in terms of protein poisoning or any of the other risks to adding high nitrogen foods, you're not going to get it from flower waste alone. Now, but what are some of the other parameters? Speaking of flowers, this is that geranium stem that went orange after I put it in here, and it has almost petrified, so it's not going anywhere. And that'll bring me up. So one of the other parameters is something I've talked about before, and that is lignin. Lignin is that cellulose or hemicellulose biochemical that gives plants structure, and leaves in particular are very high in lignin, and that makes them resistant to decomposition. Well, stems are also, because, you know, the very nature, they add structure to a plant. They also have lignin, which, like you can see from this geranium stem, makes them really resistant to decomposition. So the stem portion of the flowers, like you'll see that the geraniums that I'm putting in still have a stem attached, and the canna lily, more compressed castings, still has a stem attached. Now they are going to be more resistant, but in generally speaking, flowers, because of their low lignin content, the actual blossom part of flowers will vermicompost very quickly. In fact, they will disappear probably more quickly than most of your foodstuffs that you would put into a bin. Even though they are not high nitrogen, the low lignin content means that they are gonzo. All right, so we see lots of nice worms in here, so I'm thankful that peekaboo hasn't dried out. So that was one of the things I looked at, was the lignin content of flour waste. Now, what are some of the other parameters? Well, what about pH? The pH of flour waste is slightly acidic, but it sort of goes down to about 5.1 to around 6 something. That is not a danger zone for worms. Below 5 is a danger zone for worms. So if you're worried about the pH of flour waste, you don't need to be. It's not going to hurt your worms. Now, if you were to just decompose flowers, like let's say you were just, maybe you did the flowers for a wedding, or you're a florist and you want to just take all these flowers after the fact and dump them in a big pile somewhere and let them decompose. Well, I'll tell you, then they tend to build up quite a bit of acidity when they decompose all on their own. But when they are placed into this type of an environment or put into any compost, and this is vermicompost, that has a balance of both the flowers and other higher carbon materials, that acidity buildup is not going to happen in the flour waste. But from pH then, they are slightly acidic, but not something that you need to worry about with your worm bins. All right, so what are some of the other parameters? Well, moisture. Fresh flowers, they're supple. They have 6 to 10% moisture in them, approximating what your fresh food scraps would have. So they are similarly a really good moisture level for a worm bin. You do not need to add supplemental moisture to a worm bin. If you're thinking, oh, these flowers don't look moist, I'm going to add some moisture to my bins. Well, have no fear. When the worms and the microbes start getting into the flowers, they will release that 6 to 10% moisture, and it will maintain the moisture in your bin. Of course, that's all dependent on temperature and humidity and other types of concerns. So the other parameter I looked at in terms of flowers was whether or not flowers that came from a garden that was treated with pesticides or herbicides, whether that is carried forward and could damage your worms or damage the resulting vermicompost. Now, if worms are exposed to high levels of pesticides and herbicides, of course, at ludicrous levels, it could hurt them. At, less than ludicrous levels, it could slow their growth and reproduction. But for the most part, worms are detoxifiers. It's not going to hurt the worms per se. There was actual research done on what pesticides and herbicides would carry through into the resulting vermicompost. And it found that there were a few pesticides and herbicides that were carried forward. However, they were at levels that in the US, the Food and Drug Administration found to be sub the thresholds for any harm, like they would be safe to be used in your garden. So, again, then if you're getting flowers from a commercial source, like a florist, and you don't know the origin, I think it's safe to assume that commercial growers of flowers are going to be using pesticides and herbicides. So, just assume it, but also rest assured that the resulting vermicompost is not going to harm your worms, and it's not going to harm your eventual garden. Now, there are exceptions to that I feel I need to mention, because the research was a little ambiguous on this point, and that is when you're dealing with persistent herbicides like the aminopyralids. There are plants that are very susceptible to aminopyralids, And so if the flowers had been treated with aminopyrrolid or aminopyrrolid infected soils, then that is not destroyed by the gut of the worm. Aminopyrrolids are called persistent herbicides for a reason. They persist even through the gut of a worm. Now, some of the things that you could do if you are somebody dealing with a lot of flower waste, either you have a massive flower garden yourself, or like I said, maybe you do the church flowers or event flowers. What you could do is you could pre-compost them. If you put flower waste through a thermophilic system, where the compost is going to get hot, that will destroy a lot of the herbicides and pesticides as well. But, like I said, the research said that I think they put flower waste that had been exposed to 23 different pesticides and herbicides, and the only 2 that came through the resulting vermicompost were at levels of no harm for growing food. So it's not that it's going to harm your food, it's just that aminopyrrolids are going to harm the crops, and you don't want that either. All right, so now that I've put some of the chunkier bits down, I'm going to put my flowers down there. So the other thing I looked at was, well, what happens if the flowers themselves carry some type of disease? And, like I said, this is a canna lily, a geranium, some fuchsias, some daisies. Well, if you look at some of these fuchsia leaves, you can see some yellowing and everything. I think that's just drought damage. But what about if you had something like powdery mildew? So I looked into that specifically. What if you had powdery mildew on your flower waste and you put that into your worm bin? Well, again, powdery mildew is not going to damage the worms. Worms have processes in their gut that deal with a lot of potentially pathogenic or disease-causing fungi, but guess what? Powdery mildew isn't one of them. Powdery mildew will survive the transit through the gut of the worm, and the spores will persist into the resulting vermicompost unless you process the vermicompost for over 90 to 120 days. So if you're trying to do fast turnaround vermicompost, or you're using incompletely processed vermicompost, and you are adding flower waste that contains powdery mildew, that powdery mildew spores will persist into the vermicompost, and then by using it in your garden, you're then going to be spreading the powdery mildew through the resulting soil mix and get into your roses again. Here's just some cornmeal sprinkled to this, give it some interest. It's been 2 weeks since I've been into Peekaboo, and it'll be interesting to see how these flowers cook down and whether the worms actually really get into it. Like Rick from Gardening with Barchuck and Worms with Rick said the other day, you can miss a worm ball if you don't get in there fast enough. I'm going to try to get in this faster and see if I can catch a worm ball. Here's just some pulverized eggshell. That also will help buffer the pH. Remember I said the flower waste is slightly acidic. Like I said, I am still going to add carbon to this because I do like adding it to keep the bulk up in my bins, especially in these summer conditions that it's drying a bit. And this is some very moist, you can see the water actually coming out the bottom there. Some very moist, finely shredded wood chips. That's a really slow carbon, but I don't mind. Those wood chips are nice and swollen with moisture, so they're going to help stabilize the moisture in this bin. So, do you put fresh flowers in your bin? I did not freeze these flowers, so this is like putting fresh veggie scraps in your bin. I'm not worried about any critters that might have been on those flowers, but I am really interested that the research said that flowers have almost the perfect carbon to nitrogen ratio for worms, so they are not going to have any issues at all getting into those. And processing them into some nice vermicompost. So let's see if when I come back, do we have a nice strip of those compressed castings down this end of the bin. Thanks everyone for watching me and Peekaboo today. I'll straighten this out after I say goodbye. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.